Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Foster. I'm the chairman of the Western Australia chapter of ASIS International. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm honoured to welcome all participants to this webinar about the gender perception gap, to be presented by our esteemed guest speaker, Jo Stewart-Rattray. We have ASIS members joining us today from many nations in Asia, New Zealand, elsewhere in the Asia Pacific region, and of course several states and territories of Australia. Welcome all. I'm currently on land in Perth, Western Australia, that has been inhabited by the Whadjuk Noongar people for more than 40,000 years. As is the custom here, on behalf of the Western Australia chapter, I acknowledge the traditional owners of country in the Perth area and throughout Australia, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. I'd now like to ask Nicola Lockhart, a member of our chapter committee and champion of our Women in Security initiatives, to introduce our guest speaker for this webinar event. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. First of all, to everyone who has joined us, thank you very much for joining us. This is something that is very dear to my heart. As Kevin says, my name is Nicola Lockhart. I am the Women in Security champion at the ASIS WA chapter. Very privileged and honoured that Jo is going to be speaking with us today. I'm not going to give you too much detail because I know Jo has got a lot of detail about her own very prestigious background. So Jo, what I will do is, if it's all right with you, is I will hand over to you and we will get going. But just a quick note, if people could reserve and hold their questions, put them in the chat box at the bottom. I will do the chat at the end after Jo has spoken, so that we don't all talk at cross purposes. So we'll hold the question and discussion at the end of the session. Thank you to everybody. Jo, over to you.
Thanks, Nicola. Hello, everybody. And I'd like to tell you that I'm actually on Nadgeri country in the beautiful Clare Valley in South Australia. And I too would like to pay my respects to the local people and I pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. I'm going to just share my screen, so bear with me. It might take a sec. It's been a busy day. I've got a lot open. And with luck, you can see that without an issue. So I'm going to talk to you about diversity and inclusion, the perception gap in the time of pandemic. This is just a little bit of information about me and some of the things that I've been getting up to in recent times. Of those things, I guess most recently I was elected as Vice President of Communities for the Australian Computer Society, of which I am a fellow. And I have to say, the other thing that was kind of lovely was that in 2018, there was an award named in my honour and it's an award for excellence in the promotion of an advocacy for women in technology. And that's an ISACA award for this region. Later tonight, in fact, at 4:30 tomorrow morning, I'll actually be presenting to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. So you've caught me at a good time. I'm not sure they will. So, to start, I'd just like to say that I believe that we live in a fast-moving world of continual and rapid change, particularly in my world, which is technology and security. And the changes to the environment in which we live and work took a dramatic change, a turn that none of us expected in the beginning of March last year. Perhaps less so in Western Australia, because you guys shut your borders quite quickly, I think, and we came fairly close behind you, but still there was a difference to the way that we live and work. You know, here in this country, we talked about being in isolation, or Aussies like to cut everything short, so we would say we were in ISO. In America, it was being called sheltering in place. And we know that as a result of being in ISO or sheltering in place, the world of work may have changed more or less permanently in many respects. I thought that I should cover off a little bit about how women have been affected by the pandemic, and that we all find ourselves still living through, although I keep hearing people say post-pandemic. I think maybe that's a thought process in Australia and not so in other parts of the world. And according to WHO, even with the vaccination, that's the World Health Organization, they tell us that we'll probably not be over the pandemic for at least another year. So sorry, that wasn't bright news for you, but that's just come out in the last week or so. As UN Women stated, and this was a year ago, and they've just reiterated this statement, the COVID-19 pandemic is not just a health issue. It's a profound shock to our societies and economies, and women are at the heart of care and response efforts across the world. As frontline responders, health professionals, community volunteers, transport and logistics managers, scientists and more, women are making critical contributions to address the outbreak every day. The majority of caregivers at home and in our communities are also women. Additionally, they are at increased risk of infection and potential loss of livelihood. And in some families, it's actually the woman who has become the primary income earner for the first time, which has had a significant effect, as you can imagine, on family dynamic, which we know has put a strain on family relationships. And there has indeed been a worldwide increase in domestic violence. However, a little cheerier, in my experience, women rise to such life challenges, and an important way of doing so and ensuring that we can do that by standing together. They make strong connections. So we need to stand together, and women do that, shouldering the burden together and not losing their connections whilst being in ISO, or at least having limited mobility as we currently do. And those connections, I believe, of women are strong and tend to stay for pretty much for life. And these are some of my connections. As you can see, I have had the very great privilege of traveling extensively prior to COVID. And when I was in India, I was dead when we next got together in Chicago to wear sari. So I took up that challenge. You know, it's these very kinds of connections that can also help us in our journey towards equality, diversity, and inclusion. As I said earlier, we live in a fast-moving world of continual and rapid change, particularly, as I said, in my world of technology and security. In my lifetime, we've gone from contometers, and I wonder if anybody knows what a contometer is. It's one of those. So we've gone from contometers, which were semi-automated, yes, they were, to fully automated month-end processes in our modern ERP systems. And I have to say that I think it was fairly evident from an early age that I was going to become a geek. Because when I was about 4 years old, I remember going with my grandmother to a large department store to pay her account. And I saw a lady very much like the one on this slide. And she was wrestling with a behemoth of a machine with this huge card in it. In fact, I think it had 2 cards in it. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to be that woman. I wanted to master that machine. I also wanted to be glamorous like her and have long fingernails. But anyway, that's another story. That's probably a story for over a beer. But in our fast-moving world, we've gone from manual activities in so many areas and fields, including agriculture. And in fact, almost every aspect of agriculture in Australia used to be manual. But now we've gone to automated watering, feeding, and indeed, we can no longer even milk a cow without the use of technology. There are farms in Australia using SCADA systems and erecting their own 4G towers so they can gather the data that comes from all of that automated process. We've gone from disk drives that required 2 forklifts, one at either end, to lift them and put them in place, to having more compute power in our pockets than put humans on the moon. And you're thinking, why is she telling us this story? Well, there are some things that seem to move at a glacial pace. And unfortunately, we can count among those gender equality, diversity, and inclusion. So why do we still have the reality of too few women entering the security professions and moving up to leadership roles? The empowerment of women within the global technology/security workforce and female leadership are critical to sustaining those professions. We know that this discussion actually goes beyond the borders of the workforce, and you might be surprised to know that inequality actually has a serious effect on the bottom line of countries around the world. And as our former Australian Federal Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, said, empowering women and girls to reach their full potential lifts a country's productivity and underpins its stability. I stood in front of a banner recently that said, for us to reach gender equality in the security workforce, we would need to wait for another 80 years, given the current rate of change. It's pretty shocking, right? Well, not quite as shocking as a statement made on International Women's Day last year by Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. He said, "I do not accept a world that tells my granddaughters that economic equality can wait for their granddaughters' granddaughters. At present trends, it will take 2 centuries to close the gap in economic empowerment, a gap that is widening, not lessening by the day." He went on to say, despite women's achievements and successes, their voices are still routinely overlooked and their opinions ignored. So you can see that this is not just a story for women alone, but rather one for men and women together, because I believe that only in solidarity can we make real lasting change, by standing shoulder to shoulder this burden together. Men can and should be our greatest champions and allies. I was recently reminded of that fact in a webinar that I participated in about women in tech/security climbing the corporate ladder. Though the webinar was aimed predominantly at young women who were starting that journey, particularly in security, it was the participation reaction of the men that was most interesting to me. Most said they were not aware of the issues that women were facing in security, but they welcomed potential solutions, in part, I guess, because they have daughters and sisters and wives and nieces who likely face similar challenges if they're in or thinking of getting into the security game. And we do need allies. And in fact, I think we actually need cheer squads to make wholesale lasting change. We all know that we should not allow the world to wait for those 2 centuries. But do we know that equally, men and women? A recent survey has shown some very interesting statistics about what appears to be a gender perception gap. It was an ISACA 2020 survey which was on a global level, and a security population of over 3,500 individuals in governance, security, and risk professions. Some of the gender nuances that came out of that were really quite stunning. For example, men are confident in their negotiating skills, whilst women are not. Well, that's probably no surprise to the women in the audience this evening. But what would be surprising to you is the fact that often women were securing raises and indeed job promotions despite their lack of confidence in their negotiating skills, whilst men were less successful. Men and women agreed that women are underrepresented in the security sector, and that's a global phenomenon. But opinions vary as to the reasons for the disparity on matters of equal pay. So this is about technology, but when I say technology here, I'm talking about technology security. So over half of the female respondents, 56%, believe the lack of female role models in the sector is the primary reason for underrepresentation of women. All respondents, regardless of age or gender, report believing that women perceive IT to be a male-dominated field and know that security is a male-dominated field, and that has contributed to that underrepresentation. Concerningly, nearly 1/3 of the male respondents said that one reason that women are underrepresented in these workforces is because they find the security industry unappealing. Women actually disagreed with that vehemently. In matters of pay disparity, female respondents were twice as likely as their male counterparts, 44% versus 20%, to believe that pay inequality exists between men and women. And women professionals in the space often feel as though they're stuck in their careers, that they can't move up the ladder. And they actually don't know how to take the next step. They would really like to have female mentors who have already managed to circumnavigate the obstacles. We often hear women say that they feel that they want to see more women showcase success stories in these male-dominated environments. They feel more comfortable when they see more women. And I know in an organisation here in South Australia that is a predominantly male organisation and in the security space, it was very interesting when they came to me and said, Jo, we really want to have females in our workforce, but we don't know how to get them there. What do we do? So I said, you have to actually go and tap on shoulders and get your first woman in the door. Once you get that first woman in the door, others will follow. They feel far more comfortable when they see like visages in front of them. But that's not just a thing in the workforce either. It certainly also happens in study environments. A couple of years ago, and I was talking to Kevin and Nicola before we started the session, I was in Ireland and presenting at a conference there, and I was moderating a panel, in fact, and this discussion was really interesting group of people on the panel, and we were talking about these issues in the security workspace. And there was a young woman on the panel who was actually finishing her first year of computer science with a security major at the University of Dublin, so a very prestigious university. And she said that she went to her very first tutorial and there was just herself and 30 young men. Now, the unfortunate part about this is that they were pretty stereotypical tech security dudes and were, you know, hoodie wearing, geeky looking guys who testosterone filled, that perhaps hadn't bathed quite often enough. Sad but true. So I asked her how she felt about that, and she said, well, you know, I wasn't really bothered that much by it. I've got 5 brothers. But the other young woman felt so intimidated that she left at the beginning of the second semester. She just couldn't hack the environment any longer. Perhaps coming from a family of 6 girls had not prepared her for the situation. But nevertheless, nobody should feel that intimidated that they don't feel they can continue the course of study that they really want for themselves. Feeling part of the landscape, feeling included, is incredibly important. And that's really what that story was about. I know from my own experiences, it can be awkward when you're the only woman and you're not included in regular office activities. I think I just missed a slide. I apologise. For instance, I was working in a professional services firm, the name of which will remain blank for obvious reasons, and I was the only woman on the executive team. After about a week in the job, I was sitting in my office and I'd noticed every morning that all of the male execs would disappear for about 30 minutes every morning. So I asked one of the PAs, where do they go? And she said, oh, they go for a coffee walk to a coffee shop nearby, and they get a coffee and they walk back, discuss the day ahead, and in some cases make decisions affecting the whole practice. She said, because I then have to put half this stuff into practice when they come back. I thought, oh, hang on, shouldn't I be involved in that? So I asked the managing partner about it, and I was told, it's secret men's business, Jo. Clearly I wasn't going to be included, and indeed for the next 3.5 years I was not. And you say, why were you there for 3.5 years? Well, I didn't want a dirty big hole in the middle of my resume, so I sucked it up and lived with it for the next 3.5 years. It was pretty poor all the way around, and that was a pretty poor experience given the amount of decision making that seemed to be cemented during those coffee walks. Inclusion is even more important today for most of us, given that many of us are still working largely online. I've worked in the office 3 times since the 17th of March last year. And many organisations are making that change, that less people will be in the office, less people will be in the office, and when they do, it'll only be for you know, some kind of occasion or some kind of collaborative session. So one of the things that we actually need to do to continue that feeling of inclusion is to make sure that we take the time out for what I call virtual water cooler breaks, and, you know, hop on a Teams call or a Blue Jeans call or a Zoom call to your colleagues and have that kind of the kind of discussion that you would normally have when you pop your head over the top of your cube and talk to somebody else, or in the kitchen, all those things that you're missing out on today, but you can still do it. One of the things that I do with my team, and they're scattered around Australia, is we share quotes of the day with one another. You know, if somebody sees or if somebody sees a really funny meme, they'll send it to our small group. It's also that doing that sort of stuff has also been a way of checking on one another's mental health as well, because some people have had a really hard time working in this world. And so now I think is the time for us to all show that we are team players, even though we might be separated from one another. And now's the time to shine as a great leader as well. As I've said, it's important to be inclusive. Where there is diversity of thought, there is innovative decision making that can add to the corporate bottom line. In a 2016 paper written by Peterson Institute of International Economics, it asked the question, is gender diversity profitable? The answer was unequivocally yes. The maths were pretty simple. 30% female leadership equals 15% in net revenue increases. Impact was greatest for female executives, followed by females serving on boards. And indeed, we actually also know that where females lead a board of directors, they are far more productive than those that don't. However, the interesting thing was that the presence of a female CEO appeared to make no noticeable effect to profitability. So is that a statement about a female CEO, or is that a statement about CEOs generally? I'll leave that question mark hanging for you. Further, mandated quotas for women on boards and senior executive teams, such as those in the Arctic countries, appeared to have little or no effect on the country's profitability. And interestingly, from colleagues of mine from the Arctic region, both men and women, that I've spoken to fairly recently, it appears that there's a negative wave beginning, a reverse bias, if you like, that has begun and is common And you will hear comments such as, oh, she only got the job board position because of the mandate. So then you have to ask the question, well, is she qualified? Does she have the experience? And if the answer is yes, well, the original premise is out the window, but you shouldn't need to do that. So I will also leave the question hanging, are mandatory quotas the way to go? I don't think so. That's just a hint. In Australia, we're beginning to hear commentary from some top end of town organisations that, oh, we've done diversity, let's move on. Well, actually, you haven't. Women hold up 51% of the sky, and we're certainly not seeing that reflected in numbers in boardrooms or indeed on executives. In one instance, it was said that it was easy to find someone who was culturally or ethnically diverse rather than women. Also, in 2019, end of 2019, the Australian Institute of Company Directors conducted a survey and discovered there were still a couple of companies in the ASX the Australian Stock Exchange top 200 companies that had no women on their boards. And when the board chairs were asked why, it was said, oh, we don't know any women. I'm sure they do. And the other answer was, just as the Japanese, the former head of the Japanese Olympic Committee said, oh, we can't have women. They talk too much. The meetings would go on for too long. And that was 2019 in this country. So I ask you, is this bias creeping in? And what about unconscious bias? This will all come clear shortly, this screen. We each come with our own set of biases, baggage, and indeed conditioning. And this often affects the way that we act. Let me give you an example so we're all on the same page. Before COVID-19, I travelled internationally a lot. In fact, up to 11 international journeys a year. And, you know, I've developed a process, I suppose. The whole travel became a process for me, including I had a travel uniform. I have a particular time that I like to get to the airport, particular things I like to do in flight, all of that sort of thing. But the uniform was the important part. Casual, comfortable, can be dressed up, ladies. If you have to get off the aircraft and go straight to a meeting, you know, some jewelry always helps, a bit of lipstick, and dressed down also. After one such flight, in fact, it was back from the United Nations in 2018, after nearly 3 weeks of making a difference for rural women and girls globally with my Australian federal government colleagues on the delegation. And I was, as you can imagine, on a bit of a high. And in fact, that photo was taken just after we landed in Sydney, and I'm sitting on the flight deck of an A380 with Gus the travelling bear. And that's a whole other story. So let's set the scene. That's the travelling uniform. That was when it happened. And, you know, I was wearing, you know, the light comfy trousers and the polo shirt and the light jacket. And probably after nearly 30 hours of travel, I was probably looking a little worse for wear, but, you know, didn't think I looked like a bag lady. But anyway, I was standing in the premium boarding queue for the last leg home from Sydney to Adelaide, when a man leant forward and said, I think you're in the wrong line. Economy's over there. For some reason, and I have no idea why, I had my Qantas Platinum Elite frequent flyer card in my hand. And I was actually a bit speechless. I was a bit shocked at what he'd said to me. And I just showed him the card. And he shuffled his feet and cleared his throat, but there was no apology forthcoming. He, in fact, just turned the other way. So that man clearly had a particular bias. He thought that women who were travelling in business class, or indeed who were had high frequent flyer status, should look a particular way, and clearly I did not look that way. And another example, recently whilst at a conference, well, recently, not quite that recently, a little while ago when I was at a conference in Perth, Perth, there was a young man speaking about recruitment in the security workforce, and about the number of women that he was actually placing in security roles across the sector. And I couldn't help myself. I just had to ask the question, so how many women have you got on your team? The response, oh, I've got one, and she's really competent. I wonder if he would have said the same thing if I asked him how many men he had on his team. I'm going to guess he would have just said, I've got 10 men, or I've got one man on my team. I doubt that I would have had to hear and they're very competent. So these examples may seem quite trivial, but they actually just demonstrate that bias is a real thing and that we each face that bias. In fact, in ISACA's 2017 survey, The Future of the Tech Workforce, Breaking Gender Barriers, 27% of respondents said that they often or always experience gender bias in the workplace. That's more than 1 in 4 women from different points in their career, countries, and companies. 39% of respondents, when asked specifically about their workplace, said that they had experienced bias in the workplace at some time in their careers. So what will make us move forward? Could it actually be the bottom line? Well, according to the McKinsey Global Institute white paper, The Importance of Parity, it states that globally, companies are leaving $12 trillion on the table by not ensuring gender parity. Now, that's a big lot of money, and that's a big lot of zeros. And I actually had to go and look up how many zeros I needed to put on the slide. If these numbers are even close to being correct, it means that we are all paying the price for inequality. The UN Secretary General, who you've probably gathered is a little bit of a hero of mine, has also said, investing in women and respecting their human rights is the surest way to lift communities, companies, and countries. The longer we put off gender equality, the more we lose. Back to the security space and the professions within security that ASIS represent. There are many women thriving in security careers, but I think you'll agree there should be more. That is where awareness, showcasing of women in security, and those success stories that I spoke about before, education and cultural initiatives can make a real difference. We do know that the issue of women in security careers affects everyone, including men. I think also, as parents, we have a duty of care to ensure that if kids show an interest, and particularly if girl children show an interest in our space, then we should be encouraging them. We should be looking to create the pipeline to come up behind us. It's interesting, a colleague of mine who has been involved in just that kind of program in Queensland said that he was stunned at the number of parents who were actively dissuading their kids, their daughters, away from security careers, in particular because of the lack of salary parity, the bias, and the inequality. So let's recognise and encourage those girls who are considering such courses of study. Let's focus on the positive potential of a security career for young women. What do I want to see in our professions moving forward? I'm sure you asked that question. I'm sure I could hear that question being asked. Well, this is what I want, each for equal. The answer is simple. I want to see the generations of women coming behind those of us already in the security workforce to not have to face the same bias and in some cases blatant discrimination based on gender that I have. I personally faced not a glass ceiling early in my career, but rather a granite one. However, I was fortunate enough to have a father who was a builder, and I learnt to use a jackhammer early in life. Making a difference starts small. And as I heard a renowned environmentalist say recently, all those littles add up to a large. So in other words, try and make a difference in your own sphere of influence, even if it's just a change in the language that's being used. Workforce, not manpower. Just little things like that can actually make inclusivity real. Think about how you can make a difference also when you're recruiting. If you're in a position that you need to recruit security staff, ask HR to ensure that the first round of CVs and applications are passed to the panel blind. Now, what do I mean by blind? That means there are no pronouns, no names, no photos, no names of universities if they have a city or a country in them. This is quite an ask because most HR departments are generally under-resourced and under the pump. But it seriously takes out any bias that may be based on stereotypes, gender, or cultural background. And at least you know that when people come to interview, they're there for the right reasons. They're the best people to be there at that interview. We also know we lose women when they take time out to do what I believe is the most important thing that they do in society, and that's to create the next generation. During the childbearing years, we often find that this is the point at which we lose women and lose them for good. The time away from the professions often makes women feel as though they can't make up the lost ground and that indeed they've lost their skills. We need to do something about that. And that's when professional bodies can make a huge difference to assist women to keep their skills up by offering professional development opportunities that they can undertake in their own space and own time. Perhaps undertake a webinar while the baby is sleeping or toddler is at childcare or with grandma. Prior to COVID-19, as an employer, I had always felt an imperative that we encourage flexible working arrangements that may need to allow a parent to work from home from time to time and to work part-time in order to perform their parenting duties as well. My thinking has only slightly changed since then and since COVID. Some organisations have lived in an environment where the corporate approach has been to have what I call bums on seats, and that's, you know, an Aussie expression for people in the office sitting at their desks from 8 till 4 or 9 till 5 or 10 till 6, whatever it might be, regardless of the technology available to us to allow remote working. This was often as a result of the underlying lack of trust in employees and their ability to be productive whilst not being in the office. But with little warning, those very organisations had to change, no doubt unwillingly in some cases, and they had to trust their employees and grow to understand that it's about output, not bums on seats. I must admit it was very interesting for me. You know, I'm currently on secondment as a chief security officer in the healthcare space, and we had to move to 24/7, 365-day-a-year call centres to people's homes. And there was this great doubt about productivity and, oh, can we put surveillance software on and you know, all of that sort of stuff. And you know, I had to point out that in several states in Australia, workplace surveillance is illegal, so you can't do that. But the interesting part about it was they suddenly discovered after a very short period of time, productivity increased, there were less comfort breaks, and very little sick leave. So in fact, it put the bums on seats mentality right out the door, I'm glad to say. So the other thing that I have to say is that women have been able to juggle their work from home situation incredibly well. And I do take my hat off to those women who also, at the height of the pandemic, had to also homeschool as well, because I can tell you right now, I'm quite sure that that's not a challenge I'd be up to. So we have changed the way that we work. And one of the things that we do need to do is make sure that we make time for the home portion of our lives, even though many of us are still working from home. this is my home office, and it's just, I have sliding doors, glass sliding doors to the main living room, just off my office. And one of the things that I've done is made a rule for myself that when I hear the SBS news theme, which is at 6:30 in South Australia, that's it, I'm out of the office, except tonight, which is special. But I'm out of the office and I'm in there, and I just close those, shut everything down, close the doors, and I begin my home life. And I think that's something that we all have to do, because it's too easy to become workaholics and spend every hour in the den and not enjoying our families. From my own experience as an employer, I've found that women with children in the professional services space tend to be the hardest working and indeed the cleverest at managing that home and life balance. I remember once my husband asking me what I was working on, and I said, oh, look, I'm working on a presentation on work-life balance. He laughed. He said, what would you know about that? You have 2 speeds, stop and full bore. Unfortunately, there probably is a modicum of truth in that, but I am learning. Excuse me. I'd like you to reflect on what you have done or could do in your world to make a difference for yourself and for other women. Which is why I haven't given you all the answers to the issues I've raised this evening, because we all make a difference in our own way. But I hope I've given you at least a few hints anyway. And I have a call to action for you. And my call to action echoes my own mantra, which is dream big and believe. And the words of Meghan Markle, when she was about to be the Duchess of Sussex in 2018, she addressed UN women in New York, and this is what she said. It is said that girls with dreams become women with vision. May we empower each other to carry out such vision, because it isn't enough to simply talk equality, or one must believe in it. And it isn't enough to simply believe in it, one must work at it. So my challenge for you is to say, let us work at it together, starting now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jo. That was fascinating, and actually echoed an awful lot of my personal experiences. What I want to do now is, obviously there has been opportunity for some chat and discussion in the comments, and I just wanted to put a couple to you, Jo, just to see what your response would be. So I think the overarching theme, and certainly for me, would be the response to your statistics and to your presentation and to the things that you put forward. What has the response in general been?
There's been quite a lot of, oh my God. It's sort of those moments. It's been for some people, it's been a revelation, particularly for men who thought this was just something their wife or their sister or their niece was experiencing, not a more global issue. So that's been a really interesting point. Women, a lot of women like yourself, Nicola, have said, yep, lived and breathed that. That's exactly been my life. And others have, and most of them have stories to tell. A young woman at a presentation recently in the Northern Territory, a young woman from Africa, said that she was having trouble in the security professions because it was assumed amongst her community, African community in Australia, that she would be a nurse or a teacher. Why are you doing this other thing? So she's facing bias as a result of what she has chosen to do for her profession.
Mm. Do you think the biggest response has been indirect response to you sharing the statistics, for example, the quantitative, the monetary, loss as a result of not being diverse? Or do you think the biggest response is in terms of to the stories that you're sharing and that people are sharing?
I think it's both. I think it's a combination. I think some people respond to the numbers. They're numbers people. And so they look at those numbers and go, hooly dooly, we really need to do something about this. This is off the charts. whilst other people, the story resonates. And it's not just my story, it's the story of other women as well. So, you know, I think that's probably a 50-50 thing actually, as to who and how it resonates.
Okay, that's interesting. I know my personal experience is that I have to talk numbers before, you know, I get a seat at the table, as it were. I think in some respects that's true. In some environments, that's absolutely true. I think the big number that shocks the hell out of people is that 200 years. Yeah, and certainly in the comments, that was what was mentioned. You mentioned the positive discrimination. That's something that I come across, and I know a lot of people that I work with come across a lot, and the microaggressions that are involved in that. I mean, how do you overcome that? I know you touched on it, you sort of left it open, but how do people overcome that positive discrimination side of things?
I deal with it by confronting it head on, and you know, calling out the behaviours that go with it. So that microaggression, call it out. It's inappropriate, so I'll call it out. So yes, absolutely. I mean, there was an issue a couple of years ago. I was doing some consulting work for an organisation, and we were in a meeting room. There was the CFO, there was a consultant on the phone, and there were two of my female colleagues were in the room too, both very senior women in the organisation. And we were discussing when a particularly difficult security audit was going to have to take place. And the CFO just looked at one of these women and said, "Oh, you won't have to worry about it, Lucinda, because you'll be pregnant again by then and you won't be here." Now that, to me, my mouth just dropped. I was gobsmacked. The consultant on the phone said, "Oh, you can't say that." A male consultant said, "You can't say that." And I had to turn around and say, I called the CFO by his name and said, "Bleep, you can't do that. You really must not speak like that. That's really highly offensive." And I have found it offensive. So called it out. So sometimes the aggression that goes with some of that bias and discrimination, you just have to call out.
Have you found in recent months, years, that there is a marked improvement, or is it just more at the surface? Are we more aware of it?
Some of us are more aware of it, but others aren't. I'd always thought this may have been age related, but I have to tell you that it's not. I've found I've had extraordinary experiences recently. I was interviewing for a security solutions architect role, and helping with a client to do that. And it came to me, I had two male colleagues and we were doing it virtually. And so we were working together on this. We worked out who was asking what question. Of course, it came to me and I said, "So how would you see security architecture to fit into the security first approach that I think is really important in organisations?" And he just said, this young man who was being interviewed said to me, "Oh, Jo, I'm going to have to give a technical answer. I might need to explain it to you later." Now, this man was 30 years old, and I was horrified. And my two male colleagues on Teams immediately, and they're chatting to me going, "So what are you going to do? What are you going to say? When are you going to do it? Are you going to kill this guy?" And of course, they're only meaning figuratively. And I just said, "No, wait for it. Just wait. So when he got to the end of it, I just explained my background to him. I said, "Look, you don't need to give me a technical explanation on that. I actually come from a SCADA and operational control systems background. So I'm happy with what you've just said." And the immediate look on his face was shock, because he clearly didn't think a female visage was going to have that background. And so he actually mouthed the word "oh." And of course, he didn't get the job. But I mean, and he didn't get the job because that's not the culture that we want to encourage. We want an inclusive culture in the workplace.
Yeah. But you're finding in your discussions, Jo, are you, that these microaggressions are across the board in the security industry?
I think there are some intelligent humans out there, absolutely, that know that this is wrong and certainly don't act in that way. But sometimes I have days where I think for every great guy who has this great approach, there are two that don't. So, and other days I think everything's quite fine and it's quite an equitable day. But, you know, so I think some of that is about the people themselves as well. It's about their background. It's about what baggage they're dragging with them, their own personal bias and experience, their conditioning through their lives. So all of that plays into it.
Okay. Well, I think I have probably exhausted the questions from the sort of the chat section. Kevin, do you have anything you want to add, or are you happy to sort of open up the mics to see if anybody has any comments or any further questions?
Yes, I can see if I can.
Perhaps if anybody would like to say anything or make a comment, they could raise their hand. I think there's the action to do that. I think Joe, no. Oh yeah, they're all off mute now. Does anybody have any comments or questions?
Sorry, there's someone trying to speak.
I think Hannah.
Hannah.
Hi, hi Kevin, Nicola, Joe. Thank you so much for your talk there. One question I'd throw out there: have you got some good examples, some good models that we can take back to our companies and industry? Any good things that we can learn from?
In what regard?
Good. A good model, whether you mentioned in terms of HR, blanking of CVs, whether it be other ways to increase the representation within teams. I know you've dare I say largely parked formal quotas as such, but anything come to mind in terms of good examples?
Yeah, sure. Look, one of the things,
specific companies or otherwise.
Yeah, look, one of the things you can do is again, you can have targets. Mandated quotas don't work, but if you look to targets, that actually helps as well. So you've got something to achieve, and one of those targets can be we're going to advertise until we get 30% female respondents. And I know that the Bank of Scotland have recently done that in Edinburgh. I was talking to a colleague of mine, and we'd had this discussion about blind recruitment prior, and he came back to me and said, look, this is what we've decided to do. We want to recruit a particular security role, but we want to make sure that we promote gender equality as much as we can. And by doing that, we're going to keep this job application open until we have 30% female respondents. And they got their 30% female respondents in the 6 weeks that they had the job open for, and were able to then bring 30% women to the first round of interview. So that's one way of doing it. Another one is literally showcasing those successful women in your organisation, and showcase them outside the organisation as well as inside the organisation. So you can. Sorry, I was distracted by Hannah's comment. So that's the other way of doing it too, is that by showcasing women both inside and outside the organisation, it makes your organisation more attractive to other women to apply for roles with your organisation. And by showcasing them internally, exactly the same thing. It will make women internally feel that they have the support to try and make the next step up the ladder, or get some support. The other thing too is about mentoring programs. Now, mentoring programs are a sticky wicket internally in organisations. It's often better not to be mentored by somebody inside your organisation, because you want an independent sort of perspective. So, but there are organisations who do promote that. And I know I've been to a couple of kind of like speed dating events for organisations where you go and they and proteges decide whether they want to be mentored by you, and then they have to come and ask you. And I guess that's another thing about mentoring is if you have somebody that you want to be your mentor or champion, just ask them, what's the worst thing that they can possibly say to you? It's no, I don't have time. And that's fine. You just find somebody else. But my grandmother used to say, if you don't ask, you don't get. And that's absolutely the truth as well.
Okay. Thank you, Hannah. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments or anything to?
I might just jump in if that's okay. Jo, I'm Rachel. I'm chair of the Victorian ASIS chapter at the moment. And I wanted to ask you about, obviously, compulsory quotas not being a great idea, but having a target too. Don't you think that that might mean that any woman who is hired in that role as a result of having a target application number threshold might lose some credibility of she only got that job because they had that target or because of that process they put in place, for example? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, if people are going to be biased, they're going to be biased regardless, I guess, is the bottom line. But targets have been very successful. Westpac was a classic example of targets. They put a 50-50 target on when Brian Hetzer was the CEO a few years ago, and he made that target, and it was not by it was still based on merit. Interviews were still based on merit, so the best person still got the job, but it just gave the opportunity to ensure that there was at least 30%. Let's face it, that's not parity, right? That there were 30% of women were at least being considered. So slightly different from the mandate. The mandate is when you cannot possibly have one more man than woman in a role or in roles, and I think that's where you start getting into some strife when it's legislated, it's legal.
Yep, I absolutely agree. Thanks for the clarity though, that's great.
Not a problem.
Does anybody else have any more comments for Jo while we still have her here? No? Okay. Well, I think unless Jo or Kevin, you have anything further to add at this point, no, we're all good?
I guess all I could say is to say that somebody said there are great people out there. Yes, there are. There are great people out there also. So yeah. Just find them. You just have to find them. That's all.
Absolutely. Find them and support them.
Exactly. Absolutely. And be a champion for someone else if you can be.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. Well, listen, Jo and everybody who's joined us, thank you very, very much indeed for taking the time to listen to this. Hopefully, I know there's lots of food for thought in this presentation, lots of takeaways as well, and a bit of probably self-education, self-reflection in there for all of us, I'm sure. Thank you again for joining us. Please do spread the word. And hopefully, Jo, we will continue this journey of enlightenment, I suppose, with the ASIS WA chapter.
Excellent, thank you.
By Kevin and the committee.
Yes,
thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jo. It was very interesting, thought-provoking, and perhaps at times confronting presentation for many of us, and which I think is terrific. And I did see a few comments there where some of the men were a little bit surprised at some of the things you were saying, and I think that's terrific that you've got that kind of response, because it's going to make people sit up and think. And and I think for me as chairman of the local chapter, I'll certainly be encouraging some more discussion on some of these issues in WA, and I'm sure my colleagues in the other chapters will be doing the same thing. So thank you again, and thanks Nicola for organising this event, and thanks for everyone coming along and taking part in this. And I think it'd be terrific if those of you still online would just take your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, look up the reactions menu, and click on the clap button there just to show your appreciation. So thank you again, Jo. It's been terrific listening to you.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Jo.
much.